huge pleasure to be back here. I don't get here quite often enough, but I had a really fantastic time as a student and greatly appreciate this city for what it's given me. I came here as a student broadly uninterested in studying, and I left a great enthusiast and have never stopped studying. So I'm going to tell you today a bit about my studies, my most recent studies in democracy and democracy in Europe. As a really brief methodological comment, I want to make a couple of things clear. So firstly, I approach these topics as a political theorist, which is to say that I do sort of applied political philosophy. So in a couple of examples that we'll go through, I'll talk to you about some empirical work that I do, but they tend to be descriptive. That is to say that I try to figure out how something is, rather than being causal, trying to figure out why some things are. So I'm not going to tell you about the causes of democratic backsliding in Europe. I'm going to try to give you an analysis which characterizes some of these phenomena and then reflects about, normatively, philosophically, if you will, what should be done. Whenever we ask this kind of should question, we're essentially raising a question of applied ethics. We're raising the question of what ought rather than what is, although sometimes these are narrowly intertwined. Now, the research that I'm here tonight to share with you and to discuss with you, and hopefully also to answer questions about, I'm hoping to get some of your questions as well, is a research project which I was funded for by the Dutch Research Council, for which they have my gratitude, for which you have my gratitude, those of you who are Dutch, for financing it. And it culminated in a book, which Jaap also mentioned, Protecting Democracy in Europe. And I'm going to try and give a kind of broad brush introduction to some of the themes and the arguments of that book, without going into too much technical detail and without perhaps ignoring some of the things that I've moved away from slightly, and putting emphasis on things that I'm now increasingly interested in. And I'll be open about when that's the case. But the book, what it asks specifically, because the theme is democracy in Europe and what should be done to protect it, but what it asks specifically is it asks how European institutions should respond to the fact that European member states are backsliding on democratic and rule of law criteria, right? So the European Union, as an international organization or an intergovernmental organization, has member states, and those member states are becoming less democratic. That's broadly true, right? So most European states now are less democratic than they were 5 or 10 years ago. It's not true in every specific instance, but it's broadly true. And in some cases, it's radically true. Right? So there are some cases which we'll discuss more, some cases where European member states have become much less democratic. If we look globally, and there are indices which try to track this kind of development, which is always a little bit not a vingerwerk, right? As we say in Dutch. Hungary and Poland, they generally top the lists of countries who have regressed most on democratic and rule of law criteria. Right? And we have other cases in the context of the European Union which are also quite flagrant in terms of how far they've regressed on some of these criteria. But what do I mean when I say democratic backsliding? Let's start by defining that term, because people mean different things. And what I tend to mean, so in every European Union country we have elections, and what's important to say is that in every European Union country, those elections are broadly free. Right? So if we define democracy as free elections, they're all democratic. Now, what these elections are not in every case, and in some cases not at all, and in some cases less and less, is fair. So the way that I define democratic backsliding is that elections that might be free are becoming less fair. Now, how can an election become less fair? We can think of some obvious examples, right? If the state uses its apparatus to promote certain politics, certain ideologies, certain ideological politics, and resist others, then that skews the playing field such that the elections are no longer fair. That can be done, for example, through media capture. In Hungary, one of the primary examples, there is almost no free media. That is to say that not that media freedom is suppressed via, for example, criminal law. Right? There are not hordes of journalists in prison for what they've written, and you have some critical voices that are very critical and that still wander around the streets of Budapest. I'm friends with a few of them. But what it does mean is that Fidesz allied, so government-allied businessmen using graft, which they've gained through corruption, have purchased and control large amounts of public and private media. And this means that the media landscape is less pluralistic and less fair. And if that happens at too great a scale, we might even want to say that the elections themselves are no longer democratic elections. And that's what I think is the case in Hungary, and that's the case in some other countries, or other EU member states are moving in that direction. Yeah. There are other ways as well. We can talk about, for example, civil society, so pressure that's put on NGOs that might be critical to the government. One way that the government can try to limit the freedom of those NGOs is through financing laws, right? To put pressure on NGOs that get financing from abroad, for example, or to say that NGOs have to declare the lists of people who finance them. All of this reduces the kind of space and the freedom of these NGOs that they have in criticizing the government. And sometimes you get something which is called the capture, let's say, of civil society, right? Whereby an NGO might become what's sometimes called a gongo, a government-organized, right, NGO. And where this happens at a large scale, we might say that this civic space becomes smaller and becomes pressured. And these, to the extent that we think this is important for a free and pluralistic democratic society, we might say that these countries are no longer fully democratic. So those are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about. And the second introductory question I want to ask is, why should the EU care about the democratic character of EU member states? Right? Because arguably these processes are rather well insulated from national politics. Yeah? Individual parliaments, for example, have a relatively minimal role in EU policy and lawmaking. So perhaps one might think that national elections don't have such a direct impact on the character of European politics, particularly its democratic character. For this, I want to make three arguments. Firstly, I want to emphasize that to the extent that European politics and law has democratic legitimacy, its legitimacy is largely derivative of the democratic character of its member states. Many of the European institutions, if we take the European Council, right, the heads of state or government sit in the European Council and collectively decide some directions for European politics. And therefore, if one or several of those heads of state and government are not democratically elected or don't have, let's say, a clean democratic mandate, then that affects the legitimacy of that council. Right? Similarly, the Council of the European Union, weirdly different from the European Council. For those of you who study European studies, I don't need to tell you that. Right? Well, we have ministers of the various governments who sit in various formations, co-deciding European law proposals, right? Co-deciding what becomes European law. And where those ministers are elected or appointed in procedures which are not themselves democratically legitimate, we might say that the outcome of those processes is tainted. Right? You can make a simple analogy to a national context to really get this clear. Let's take France as an example. Right? And imagine in France you have the Assemblée nationale that decides national legislation. And the Assemblée nationale is elected through free and fair democratic elections. 2-round elections, constituency-based, for those of you who are interested in political science. But let's imagine that all of the delegates from a particular region, say Brittany, are not elected via democratic elections, but are still appointed according to a noble birth. If that's the case, we might worry that the legislative output of the French Assemblée nationale is no longer democratic, or at least that its democratic character is tainted. And especially where laws are passed using that block of votes from Brittany, if that moves a proposal over the threshold of majority, we might really worry that that's not a democratic decision. And similarly, we can have similar sorts of worries about the democratic character of various European institutions. Secondly, I would argue that the European Union has some responsibility, or some complicity even, which I'll return to, in democratic backsliding processes. The way in which European integration has unfolded, I think, is partially responsible for some of these outcomes. Both, for example, in the way that European Union funding has been captured by some of these autocratic or wannabe autocratic elites, and in the way that, for example, admissions procedures sped up and set certain standards, but then sort of abandoned the maintenance of those standards, right? We have rather high demands of the Copenhagen criteria for entering the European Union, but then actually membership itself, the demands of membership in terms of their formal character, so the rule of law criteria and the democratic criteria, are lower. These might be problems that are baked into institutional design, and it might mean that the European Union has some kind of responsibility, right? So then another reason for the European Union to care, for European Union institutions to care, might be because they owe some sort of duty of redress. If they are partially at fault, then those harmed by that fault arguably have some sort of claims, right? We need to meet those claims of justice to redress these harms. And lastly, a more straightforward political science argument, we might be worried about authoritarian contagion or diffusion. Right? The idea is that if near countries with which we are intimately connected become more authoritarian, the chances are higher that our own country, the country where we live, or the country of our citizenship, becomes more authoritarian. So that's another reason why various actors of European politics might worry about democratic backsliding. Now, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to give a sketch of some of the arguments of the book and roughly following the structure of the book. First, I'm going to focus on backwards-looking sort of historical perspectives. I don't want to say historical out loud, pretend I didn't say that, because I'm not a historian. I'm not going to make a historical argument as such. But there's a part of the book, the first part, which is basically diagnosis. There the question is, what went wrong? Right? That has a historical component, but it also has a component of looking at where we are now, right? Looking at the kind of policy and political institutional framework and what might be wrong with it. And that's the focus of the first few chapters of the book, and will be the focus of the first part of the next part of the talk. And then, unsurprisingly, the second part will be, what should we do differently? Right? What can be done? And there I will look at trying to put together a kind of agenda or a kind of program for democracy protection in Europe. And it will consist of 3 prongs. The first will look at how EU institutions are complicit and what might be done about that complicity. Right? This redress element that I was talking about. The second, recognizing that already authoritarian actors have become much more powerful in the last 15 years. The second prong looks at containing those authoritarian actors, and the last at cultivating pluralist democracy. And I'll end with what might sound like a radical proposal, because one of the core arguments of the book is that even if those 3 steps were taken, the European Union is constrained in important ways by what it legitimately ought to do. Right? Not all options are on the table. Even some things that might be effective would be illegitimate. And if that's the case, and I will have argued that 3 steps are needed normatively, that's what the kind of the ethical analysis of the situation requires, we still might be in a situation where certain countries, certain member states are becoming more autocratic. And I argue that if that's the case, then we should rather think about a limited dissolution of the European Union. We should think about things like expulsion than trying to cross that line into what would be normatively, for me, unacceptable forms of trying to deal with the problem. What that means ultimately is that I think that expulsion and disassociation, including withdrawal in certain specific contexts, are better than the alternative. And I'll try to make that case, controversial though it is. Let's then go back to this what went wrong perspective, and I'll give you a few indications of my analysis in this kind of backward-looking or diagnostic stage. So firstly, in the second chapter of the book, I look indeed sort of historically. I try to come up with what I call a sort of genealogy. I don't want to annoy any people who do real genealogical analysis. I'm very tempered with what I claim, but I say I do a sort of genealogy in the sense that I'm interested not on the kind of causal question, what leads to what, but I'm interested in understanding what's missing, understanding a problem, what might not be said, and what might be reflected in the current institutional and political landscape. And I come up with two things. I say that two kind of problems are membership fatalism and depoliticization. Now, these are not the only problems, right? I'm not giving a kind of all-in argument. But I think these are problems which are overlooked in the analysis of democratic backsliding in Europe. And by membership fatalism, I mean the idea that each member state is ultimately sovereign over their own membership. I've already mentioned something along this line, right? There's a weird kind of asymmetry between the extremely high and demanding requirements of membership for an acceding state, and afterwards the relative abandon of any kind of check, especially earlier on. These things are changing, we'll talk about that in a moment, but any kind of check on the rule of law and the democracy of a country once you're a member. I think this is a deep mistake. And by depoliticization, I mean the attitude that the correct response, the appropriate response to democratic backsliding in member states was judicial, and that political responses were both extremely dangerous or inappropriate, and if at all we're going to take that path, they would need to be unanimous. This combination of these ideas I call the depoliticization of values conflicts. And both of these things have a particular kind of history. They have a particular way that they've come about. In the 1990s, when the European Union was going through a period of large expansion, member states at the time started to worry that some of the newer member states might not be so committed to democracy and to liberal democracy, let's say broadly, as the current member states were. As a little parenthèse, this is a deeply bizarre idea, because most of those were recent post-fascist regimes. Right? But nevertheless, these new post-Soviet regimes were considered to be especially threatening compared to, let's say, Italy, Germany, Spain. And therefore, people started to think about how to include a sort of sanctions mechanism for if some of these states would regress on democratic governance. And we see in the Treaty of Amsterdam, which was signed in 1997, for the first time a sanctions mechanism, right? A mechanism that proposes some sort of sanction for the violation of these fundamental values of the EU. Now, it's at that point in time when the option of expulsion, which is actually a live option in many of these international treaties, right? The Council of Europe has an expulsions mechanism, for example, was considered and rejected. It was actually proposed, almost ironically, most seriously by the EPP, which would now be one of the groups most opposed to these sorts of actions. So the center-right, I hesitate to even call them a center-right party anymore, the right-wing grouping in the European Parliament. At the same time, you have the questioning, so the end of what sometimes called the permissive consensus in European politics. You have real Euroscepticism coming up in different member states. You have real challenges to the idea of European integration coming up. And the result is actually a series of changes in the Treaty of Amsterdam and then later the Treaty of Nice, which introduce many more democratic elements in European politics. So you have both this increased interest with the democratization of European institutions, but then you also have ultimately a resignation of the idea that expulsion should be considered. Because expulsion, if you have expulsion as the sanction for the violation of fundamental values, that's the stage at which you really say, okay, there's a red line that we can draw around some governance norms, right? If you're not democratic, you can't be in this club. And this was something that was ultimately stepped back on because member states were worried, as they have been in different contexts as well. They've been worried to give up this kind of competence for themselves. And the result is that everybody retained this kind of sovereignty over their membership, or at least that's what it seemed. I'll make some criticism of that idea at the end of the talk. These things came to a head. I'll give one little story which I think illustrates this well, in the way that European member states responded to the inclusion of a far-right political party, depending on how you count, probably the first time that this happens in a European Union member state. In that case is Austria in 2000, so just after the turn of the millennium. The FPÖ under Jörg Haider had performed very well in this election, and there was increasingly in Austrian politics, there was discussion about them forming a government with the center-right Austrian People's Party. At that time, and this might be difficult to imagine from now, at that time that was considered very shocking. Right? And all the other member states, the EU 14, it's sometimes referred to, organized to try to prevent a government between the far right and the center-right in Austria. And what they did was Guterres, who we know now in a different function, he was at the time Prime Minister of Portugal, and Portugal held the rotating presidency of the Council, and Guterres tried to organize a diplomatic boycott. And it was presented as a threat. If you form a government, speaking to the center-right, if you form a government with Jörg Haider, then the result will be that you're frozen out of bilateral diplomatic relations. And that's exactly what happened. Right? So they did form a government, and immediately we see these 14 bilateral freeze-outs start. But this experience was extremely troubling. Initially, there were some successes. Jörg Haider himself was not a member of the Austrian government. Right? His deputy took his stead. But quickly, this unity amongst the 14 member states started to water out and water down. And it was considered to be very awkward and very problematic because in the European institutions, we still had to collaborate with the Austrians, right? They couldn't be frozen out of EU politics. There was no mechanism for that. The European legal system couldn't be used because there had been no violations of fundamental values at that point. There was just the risk or threat of violations based on an anti-Semite who has a history of these extremist remarks and a platform which we might reject. But there was no actual violation to try to pursue via the courts. So ultimately, via something which was embarrassingly called the Wise Men's Report, ultimately sanctions were turned down. They made some declaration that they would respect democracy, and people backed off. This led to two things which I want to highlight. Firstly, it led to a broad group of the people involved in the politics of this moment to conclude that a political response to a democratic threat was the wrong one, instead of potentially that response was the wrong one. Right? So a political response in general was considered to be problematic, and this led to a very careful, a very overly careful, one might say, situation in the 2010s when we see Orbán coming up. And then secondly, it actually led to a revision of the sanctions mechanism. But rather than saying, no, the sanction mechanism needs to be revised because it's too weak, what was actually added in the Treaty of Nice was an additional dialogue step Because the worry was the sanction mechanism, it's too strong. We couldn't use it because the sanction, and we'll get to the sanction in a moment, is too powerful. Right? So we need to introduce more dialogue steps, more negotiation steps before this sanctioning mechanism can be used, can be applied. The consequence of that, I argue in the book, is that when we get the next serious threat to democracy in Europe, with the election of Orbán and the coming up of Orbán and Fidesz in Hungary, we have a political elite in the European institutions which is extremely wary of a political response, who also think that the right way to do things is not via a sanction, which would need to go via the courts, but via dialogue and monitoring and negotiations. The result is broadly a decade of what Viktor Orbán calls his peacock dance, whereby he gets a challenge from a European institution, he makes some reforms which are, at best, cosmetic, and then bides time so that the reform can make actual impact, which is very difficult to change on the ground. Right? And this has solidified and consolidated autocratic processes in Hungary and in all other countries which mirror Hungary in these processes. Another step that I took in the book, so that I want to move on from this kind of historical frame to the more empirical part of the book, is I was interested in looking at how democracy was really conceptualized and conceived of in European institutions, because this argument that I just made, it runs on the idea that European officials were actually had a particularly depoliticized understanding of democracy, right? At least in this period. So what I did is I collected 155 speeches by European commissioners over the Juncker and the first von der Leyen commissions. And I just identified every instance wherein any of these commissioners in these commissions used the word democracy to try to see what they meant with the word democracy. What are they using the word democracy? In which context are they using it? Again, I'm not trying to do anything causal, right? I'm trying to understand how they speak about democracy. And if this matches what I worry about, which is that this rather depoliticized understanding. I found 480 references in these speeches, right? Looking at all of the speeches by all of the commissioners in this period of time. And I coded 432 of those which had some kind of meaning. Right? There were a few references which were so vague or so throwaway that you couldn't really code them, and I coded a good 400 of them. And indeed, what I saw was that a huge number of those references, a vast number of those references, had to do with things like the rule of law, fundamental rights, quality of information, right? Things that you wouldn't, if you would ask a political scientist to define democracy, they would not be at the core of the definition of democracy. They might be necessary for a healthy functioning democracy, but they would not be at the core of their definition. And barely 5% of the references were about elections, for example. There are only 20 references of all of the coded references which had anything to do with elections. There were only 24 that had anything to do with pluralism, so anything to do with the idea that democracy is about competing ideas. Yeah. I concluded that indeed the commissioners' ideas about democracy, the way they spoke about democracy, was depoliticized. And I called this democracy without politics. And we might worry about that kind of attitude towards democracy where commissioners are tasked, where the European Commission is tasked with being a guardian of democratic values. Right? Democracy is one of the core values of the European Union via Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. But if commissioners have this very depoliticized, very technocratic, legalistic understanding of democracy, then they might not be well equipped in that role, right, of guardian of the treaties. Next, I looked at the actual mechanisms themselves. Right? How well do the sanctions mechanisms that exist, how well are the tools that exist for various European institutions to respond to democratic decay in European member states, how well are they equipped to do so? Not empirically, right, in the sense of what's most effective, but philosophically. How well are the sanctions and the mechanisms, in fact, how well do they reflect a democratic ethos, or might there be some tensions with a democratic ethos? In this context, I used an approach in political philosophy which is known as immanent critique, and the idea is that I look within the political and legal, let's say, context of European institutions and law to derive the values that I use to analyze those laws and principles. Right? So it's a kind of, in a sense, it's circular, right? You take from the legal and political context the values, and then you do what amounts to a coherence check. Right? How coherent are these values? This is a methodology that I find very interesting, but it has its limitations. I want to be clear about those, right? If you do a kind of coherence check or an immanent critique of Nazi ideology, it's not going to be very interesting, right? Because you put bullshit in, you get bullshit out. No one cares whether the Nazis were coherent in how they tried to implement their Nazi ideology, right? That's not what's at stake. But if we actually if we accept the values that are internal to a certain praxis, then these immanent critiques can have legs, they can have some interest. And they help us avoid trying to make a kind of first principles defense of democracy first before doing an ethical or a philosophical analysis. Right? Otherwise, I'd need to write a 1,000-page book on why I think democracy is great, and then I can start to criticize things for being anti-democratic. Right? Whereas this step allows me to say, no, you commit yourselves to democracy in Article 2, in Article 10, in Article 11. Right? The European Union and European Union actors commit themselves to democracy, and then they undermine democracy in various ways. That's kind of shortcut. I look at 4 different mechanisms. The one I've already spoken of, the kind of main one, which is the sanctions mechanism that's in the treaty. It's Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union. Then I also look at the kind of standard EU law mechanism which can be used when member states violate EU law. The idea there is, because commitment to democracy is in the treaties, undermining democracy is illegal in the context of European Union law. So you can also use the standard mechanism, which is called an infringement action. It's based on Article 248 to 260 of the Treaty on the Functioning, 58, sorry, to 260 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And this allows either member states or the European Commission to take another member state to court for violating EU law. Now, generally, this is used in trade kind of context, right? But arguably, this can also be used in the context of democratic decay. Third, I look at the procedure whereby EU funding becomes conditional on some kind of governance norms. Now, in 2020, we had a new regulation, which is still referred to colloquially as the rule of law conditionality regulation, although it doesn't really protect the rule of law, or it doesn't make EU funds conditional on EU rule of law performance. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then lastly, I examine a procedure which is virtually unknown outside of the kind of EU studies and EU politics circles, which is a procedure for deregistering EU political parties. So EU political parties and political foundations have a legal obligation to uphold fundamental values like democracy and the rule of law. And if they don't do so, in theory, they can get deregistered, which has a massive impact on their funding. Now, in practice, the authority which is tasked with this check has never deregistered a party for violating fundamental values. And then I'm not talking about like Fidesz. Like Fidesz is a very tame, Fidesz is Viktor Orban's party, right? They're a very tame kind of autocratic party, right? We have also in the European Parliament some pretty extreme neo-Nazi parties, for example, that have not been deregistered by this mechanism. So potentially it might not be effective, but again, my question is not effectiveness, my question is whether it's coherent with democratic values to deregister parties in these cases. And I'll maybe give an argument that might surprise you in a moment. And what I try to do is I try to say, okay, what are these mechanisms for? At least in the context that I'm considering them, they are for protecting democracy. And we're going to consider whether they are coherent ethically with that task of protecting democracy. And to know whether they can be coherent at that, we need to look at the sanction, and we need to think whether that sanction has a democratic or an anti-democratic effect. To start with the Article 7 sanction, that's actually why I started with this kind of coherence approach and this analysis, was via looking at Article 7. Article 7 has been widely criticized, and mostly it's been criticized because at one step in the Article 7 process, which is the treaty mechanism for sanctioning member states that violate fundamental values, at one crucial step, it requires unanimity with the exception of the member state that's being sanctioned. Now that's procedurally a huge step. It requires unanimity of member state governments, essentially. This is procedurally a really high threshold. And the result has been that no member state has ever been sanctioned via the Article 7 procedure. And a lot of people worry about the efficacy of the procedure for that reason. But when I was looking at this, when I was reading it, I focused on a different part of Article 7, which is the last two clauses in the article, which holds, firstly, it gives the description of the sanction that could be imposed if ultimately a member state is found in grave violation of fundamental values. And the sanction that it describes, it's open-ended, but the description of an example that's given is that the member state would lose their right to vote in the council. And as a kicker, the last clause says, but all of their duties would remain under the treaties. Right? That is to say, they lose their right to participate in EU lawmaking as equals, because the Council has a very important role in EU legislation, but they remain subject to European law. And this reminded me of a whole different literature in political philosophy, which I've also dabbled in and find interesting, which is about criminal disenfranchisement. Right? Broadly, many political theorists, including myself, worry a great deal about the idea that criminals can be legitimately disenfranchised. There are loads of arguments that can be given. Maybe we have a social contract that they break, whatever, right? But ultimately, when you imprison someone for breaking the criminal law, you are subjecting them to the law. And by removing their right to vote, you remove their possibility, basically, to represent their claims. And you make them an unequal member. Whereas my conception of democracy is founded on democratic equality. In fact, that's the whole reason we need democratic procedures, because there's no extra political mechanism for saying that's the right ideology, that's the right religion, that's the right bakery where you should buy your pain au chocolat, etc. Right? We don't have an extra political mechanism to make these sorts of value judgments. So we say everybody's view is equal, formally equal, not substantively equal. And then the result is the law in which we impose on everyone equally. And my worry about Article 7 was broadly the same worry. How can we keep, let's take Hungary as an example, let's say Hungary was denied their right to vote in the council, the Hungarian government. How can we keep the Hungarian people subject to EU laws that they don't have an equal stake in authoring? This argument is about the incoherence of Article 7. I'm arguing that it has an anti-democratic effect, which is the subjugation in my example of the Hungarian people. So it cannot be used to express a commitment to democracy, to try to enforce a commitment to democracy, because it has this anti-democratic effect. And I do a similar kind of coherence check with the other three instruments that I've described. I won't go through the detail of it, but I argue that the rule of law conditionality regulation is much more similar, if we make analogies, to a kind of fine, right? Everyone's equally subject to the fine, and it doesn't undermine anyone's formal civil and political rights to be imposed a kind of fine. Right? So that seems to pass this coherence check. It's not to say that it's a good tool, right? That also raises questions of efficacy and so forth, but it's not an incoherent tool. And I make a similar conclusion when I look at the infringement procedures via Article 258 to 260, right? These EU law procedures. There might be other things wrong with them. They might not be very efficient. They might need to be reformed in certain ways, but they're not incoherent from a philosophical perspective. The deregistration, I argue, is similar to Article 7, it raises a similar problem, because the result of deregistration, in theory, is that a political party loses an equal funding access. It's perhaps less grave because they can still participate in EU elections, right? It's not a party ban in that sense, but they lose a great deal of what makes elections between European parties and groups a fair process. So I argue that this also has an anti-democratic effect. This doesn't mean necessarily that these tools should never be used. What it does mean is that the legitimacy threshold for their use is going to be much higher. And this goes into a territory, which I'll come back to at the end, of what's called militant democratic theory. Militant democratic theory asking exactly that question. When can democracies undermine democratic norms to protect democracy? It's a question that Karl Lauenstein, a German jurist who fled to America, asked during the rise of the Nazi Party. Right? When he was very critical of the German liberals, right, for being far too tame in trying to fight fire with fire, as he put it. But all militant democratic theorists broadly, all is a word which you should never use in academia because you're always wrong, but most militant democratic theorists broadly agree that the legitimacy thresholds for the use of these kind of militant tools, so when the value is undermined by the tool itself, but it seeks to protect that value, are much higher than in other tools. For reasons that are kind of obvious, right? If it's not necessary to undermine your own values, then why would you do so? Right? If you have access to tools that don't do that, that could be effective, then you should use them. If the threat is not very serious, why would you sully your own values? Right? You can use other tools to do so. And I'll return to that right at the end when I argue for expulsion. That kind of finishes what I wanted to say about this diagnostic part and the bulk of the talk, because now I want to move into this kind of programmatic approach, and I want to give mainly the principles by which I think European actors ought to respond. So there were three kind of, a three-pronged approach, let's say, and then this kicker that perhaps even if the right things were done, it might not be enough, and what then? Now, the first of these three is centered around the idea of complicity. And in the book, I make an analysis of complicity which draws on the work of Bob Goodin and Chiara Lepora, who wrote a great book on complicity. Lepora is a doctor and Goodin is a political philosopher, and they're trying to think about situations. Ultimately, the book tries to ask the question of what if you have to be complicit in certain contexts. They use a very explicit and disturbing example from Lepora's work, which is that a soldier approached Lepora and asked, what if during rape should I use a condom? Right? That's a very troubling question for a doctor to answer, because saying that they refuse to answer, so keeping their hands clean of the problem, would be the only way not to become complicit. But answering yes when you're raping, you should use a condom. Right? That's actually going to result in lower harm. And that's an ethically extremely troubling but very interesting problem. And they make an argument for complicity and for the need in complicity at some points. I won't talk about that further here, but the point of their analysis that I emphasize is that there's an interesting and important distinction between complicity by omission and complicity by action. Right? Complicity in what you do and complicity in what you don't do. Now, complicity when you do something, it's easy to understand. If you make some kind of contribution to someone else's wrong, then you're complicit in that wrong. And if you enable or encourage or equip someone to do something that's evil, then you're complicit in that evil, which means that you have certain duties, right? The primary wrongdoer has the main duties of redress, of compensation, or whatever, but you also have some duties. Complicity by omission is harder. It means that you should have done something that you didn't do. Right? You should have acted in some way and you didn't act in that way. It's harder also in terms of its implication, because when you're complicit by omission, the way to resolve that complicity ethically, it's not enough to stop doing something or to compensate people in whatever way is considered appropriate. You also need to actually do the thing that you ought to have been doing. Right? So it requires a positive action. And I consider the question whether European institutions are complicit in this way in democratic backsliding in EU member states. And I argue that because of their mandate, various EU institutions are especially complicit in omission, right? In not having acted according to their legal role, according to their mandates to respond to democratic backsliding and rule of law backsliding. And that means that's an independent reason, let's say, for these actors to act, right? Because they are wrong, they have wronged people in not having acted. That also might generate, interestingly, duties of compensation to those harmed by democratic backsliding. Right? So for example, I think that the European Commission or various other European institutions might have duties of compensation to citizens of countries which have backslid on democratic values. That's a bit of a backwards thinking, right? Because often we might want to see these countries as the ones who've done wrong, but it's the governments of those countries that have done wrong, increasingly outside of the scope of democratic controls on their behavior. Right? So the citizens are the first ones who are victims of that behavior, and they might be owed duties of compensation. I can speak a little bit more about the Q&A, about which institutions I think are complicit in which ways. The next prong, so the first prong, let's say, the first urgency of the response to democratic backsliding is to redress complicity. Where you are complicit, redress complicity. The second prong I argue for is to contain autocratic actors. And this requires recognizing that we're already in a situation where authoritarian or autocratic or at least democratically ambivalent actors are embedded in many European institutions. Right. We have, to start with the Commission, we have a vice president of the European Commission now who comes from a neo-fascist party. We have at least 2, if not 3 members of the Commission who have similarly, right, the commissioners, who have similarly tainted democratic mandates, and who, in the case of, for example, Varhelyi, who have actively undermined democratic values in the past. If we look at the heads of state and government sitting in the European Council, we have one, by my count, who no longer represents a democratic state, but an authoritarian state, a competitive authoritarian state, Viktor Orban, and we have several others who have deeply problematic relationships to democracy. Right, so we are in a situation where we're not talking about prevention anymore, we're also talking about how to deal with authoritarians embedded in these institutions. And here, I just want to illustrate, I said I would go quickly and a bit programmatically, I want to illustrate the principle that I think should drive this kind of containment. Containment, in my book, I distinguish between political and economic containment and legal containment. We can talk about those details if you want in the Q&A. But the principle, I think, is the more important one. And simply, I argue that the more authoritarian a member state government is, the more actively it should be contained. And once a member state government has crossed a threshold of becoming an autocratic or authoritarian government, then they should be maximally contained to the degree that those containment steps are coherent with fundamental values. And this goes back again to my argument that I was giving about militant democracy. Right? So to the maximum extent whereby containment acts within the framework of a democratic ethos, this should be applied once a member state has become authoritarian. The third prong of my argument is about cultivating pluralist democracy. And we could pause for a moment about why EU actors should cultivate pluralist democracy, but then we're going to rehearse again some of these early arguments. They should do so because of the worry about contagion. They should do so because the democratic legitimacy of every EU member state is tied in to the democratic legitimacy of every other state. Right? In the Netherlands, for example, which is where we are now, the democratic character of the Netherlands is tied to the democratic character of Hungary, right? Because we are co-subjects to EU law, which is co-decided by Hungarian principles. So where their democratic character is undermined, so the democratic character of the laws that bind us in the Netherlands is undermined. We should do so because European institutions might do so because they are complicit and no duties of redress, all these different reasons. And supporting pluralist democracy in countries where it's under pressure might be one way to meet those duties. Right. I came to this idea, or I started working on this problem after I gave a talk at the political meeting, or the yearly meeting of the D66 party, I think 4 or 5 years ago. And after the talk, I was talking with some officials from D66, and they were asking me, okay, what should we do? Right? And the focus at that point, also because of what I'd spoken about, was really what kind of things can we pressure the Dutch government to do in European institutions? And what kind of things can we do as, via the Dutch government in European institutions? Right? So for example, how can we ensure that the Dutch government takes more cases to the courts using their authority under the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union with these infringement actions? Or how can we pressure the European Commission to sharpen the budgetary constraints, right, this conditionality mechanism that I spoke about earlier? And at some point I said, well, why don't you think more about what you can do? Right? You're thinking about how can we influence someone who can influence someone who might be able to do something else, but you can also think at a much more local level about what, for example, a political party or a civil society organization or citizens or individual members of parliament, right, what they can do to support their pairs, their homologue, right, in these countries that are under growing pressure. And this was almost absent from discussion at the time. It was put on the agenda a little bit by the mayor of Budapest, who was talking about these kind of networks of democratic support. But it was largely overlooked. And I think there's a huge gain to be made in much more direct democracy support, because treaties constrain EU actors, sometimes for good reason, in the extent to which they can get involved in the domestic politics of a country. But those constraints don't apply to the political actors. Or they don't apply in the same way. They certainly don't apply in the same way to civil society actors. And we can see that in the political realm, right, in the far right, or these democratic challengers, these authoritarian actors, we see increasingly constellations of support. We saw only last week, right, this election video of Orbán, where you see the whole row of them, from Meloni to Le Pen, all lining up and giving their praise of Orbán's politics and so forth. They are getting involved in each other's domestic politics. And I think pro-democratic actors can be much bolder in doing so. With a view to the time, then, I want to move to the last point. So, the last point of my talk, I want to talk about this militant democratic threshold. Right? So I've said that militant democracy is about the question of when it is legitimate to act anti-democratically to protect democracy. Earlier, I described some of the arguments I made in chapter 4 of my book, where I argue that, for example, the Article 7 sanctions procedure and the procedure for deregistering parties and foundations, that they fail on the coherence test. Right? The sanctions themselves undermine democracy. But perhaps sometimes it's appropriate. Perhaps sometimes it's appropriate to undermine democracy in democracy's defense. This was the question that Karl Laurenstein asked himself. And the sorts of anti-democratic actions which have been argued to be justifiable in democracy's defense are things at the national level, right? Things like party bans, things like disenfranchisement. I mentioned criminal disenfranchisement earlier. That's sometimes argued to be a pro-democratic or a militant democracy sanction. In some countries, it also applies mainly to political sorts of offenses, like in France, where it can be combined with a prison term for those who violate laws which have to do with democratic integrity. Right? And if you look at this literature, then we see many militant Democrats cohere around two standards that are required for the legitimacy of militant sanctions. And then the necessity requirement and the existential threat requirement. For reasons that I've alluded to slightly before, right? If the threat is not serious enough, then you'd say as a Democrat, well, why then sully your own values, right? You can, if the threat's not serious enough, you don't need to sully your own values to meet the threat. Not everyone agrees on this, but it's a broadly shared view. And secondly, this necessity condition, right? If you can find some kind of non-anti-democratic way to respond, then why would you undermine the values that you're trying to defend in your response? Right? So these conditions, they're kind of logical, let's say, with the idea that what they're trying to protect, what a militant Democrat is trying to protect, is democracy. Not for the sake of democracy, abstractly, but because they are Democrats, right? Because they are in favor of democracy, because democracy has some kind of value. Right? And I ask in the last chapter then, okay, perhaps we should think in terms of this militant democratic literature also about these sanctions that I've analyzed, like Article 7 and deregistration. But I say, okay, let's take those two criteria and let's think about European politics in the context of those criteria. Is the threat existential? It's an empirical question. In the beginning of the talk, I bowed out of empirical research. Right? I said I don't do much of that. But clearly, if we look around us, it seems pretty grave, the threat. Increasingly so. At least, I think we can probably agree that the threat could be existential. Whether or not it currently is the case is a separate discussion, an interesting one, but it certainly could be existential. So let's say that we meet that criteria, or that it can be met. Then the question becomes, is it necessary? Is it necessary to undermine democratic values to protect democracy in Europe? Now, in the national context, it's make or break for a national entity, for a polity. Right? If the polity is captured by autocrats and becomes an authoritarian state, then democracy is no more. But that's not quite analogous in the European context. European Union politics is still, or has important elements of an intergovernmental organization. European studies scholars like to argue that it's sui generis, that it's unique, that it's a blend or a pooling of sovereignty, but ultimately, member states, as I've discussed, have sovereignty over their membership, right? Whether that's good or bad. Ultimately, they are the ones that are members because they accede to treaties. They can withdraw from treaties, as we saw from the European Union treaties, as we saw with Britain. Right? So I argue that this disanalogy is important because an option which is almost taboo in European politics is rarely discussed, which is the option of disassociation or expulsion. Right? If a member state was to become frankly autocratic, and all three prongs of my strategy for coherent democracy protection would have been taken, right? Steps to reduce the complicity of EU institutions, steps to contain the autocracy maximally once it becomes authoritarian, right? Steps to try to cultivate pluralist democracy as much as we can. Once these steps have been taken, it's still possible that a member state continues to regress. Perhaps the authoritarian policy has captured the economy so much that it's hard to displace them. And there are certain things which are, I argue, unacceptable. Right? We don't have a European army or a European police force that can go into an autocracy and change the government. Right? These are not even desirable things. Right? So then I argue, need to think about dissociation and expulsion. Because if we can find a way legitimately to dissociate from autocratic states or to expel them, and that does not undermine democratic values, then we've answered our necessity point, because then Article 7, disenfranchisement, is not a necessary move to contain an existential threat, right? With expulsion on the table. Now, expulsion is something which, as I've said, is considered taboo. It also is not written in the treaties. The only mechanism to withdraw from the European Union is Article 50, whereby a member state withdraws, right? As was the case with Great Britain. But I argue that that actually gives space for an expulsion mechanism, because if one member state can withdraw, then many can withdraw. And many can withdraw in a coordinated fashion. Right? And if that's true, then we need to look at the mechanism of the withdrawal procedure. You see that you need a qualified majority to negotiate terms of withdrawal. That is to say, once you have a qualified majority in the council, then you can negotiate withdrawal on whatever terms you like. If you have a coordinated withdrawal from the European Union of a qualified majority of member states, then you can withdraw and rebuild. The same institutions, the same laws, the same procedures. You can withdraw the resources from the old EU and plug them into a new European Union. Ultimately, what this has, it's a roundabout way of describing it, but what it does is it expels the member states that are not part of this withdrawal mechanism. Right? Now, again, this sounds pretty outlandish, but the point is not to say that this should be done soon, not to say that this is likely to happen. The point is to say it's possible. And if it's possible, then the anti-democratic responses are not necessary. And ultimately, what I really hoped with the book is to start a conversation about what those red lines might be to discuss things like expulsion. Like, what are the values as a European community that we really think are fundamental to the extent that we would not countenance continued membership, continued supranational integration, sharing sovereignty with a state that violates those values? And if anything, that's the question I want to leave you with tonight. Thank you very much.